Hey, everybody. It's Chris Ryan, the co-host of The Watch with Andy Greenwald. I wanted to tell you a little bit about one of my favorite shows on the Ringer Podcast Network. It's Ringer FC, which is really two shows. So on Mondays and Thursdays, the Ringer FC hosts Stadio, which is basically my favorite football podcast. It's Ryan Hunn and Musa Okwonga talking about all the major leagues in Europe, the La Liga, Premier League, Serie A, Bundesliga, talking about national teams, getting ready for this next World Cup, and talking about the women's game. And then on Wednesdays, we have Wrighty's House, which is the show from Ian Wright, who was an Arsenal legend, one of the greatest strikers to ever play football, and has become really a darling of the modern media world. You may have seen him on Ted Lasso. You may have seen him on Match of the Day and other soccer broadcasts. He's just incredible. Those two shows have a lot of crossover. You'll sometimes hear Ryan and Musa on Wrighty's House. You'll sometimes hear Wrighty on Stadio. You can find Ringer FC Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Anytime Fitness. We may talk a whole lot about sports, but when it comes to keeping fit ourselves, there's definitely room for improvement. I hit this point early July. I was just like, I am not in good enough shape. I started trying to walk at least 15,000 steps a day or hiking or just anything to keep my legs moving. Now it's the end of 2023. I feel great. I had a physical 3 weeks ago and the guy was like, you're doing great. You're doing better than you were 3 years ago. I felt great. Whatever your goals are, progress is possible thanks to Anytime Fitness. Get a personalized plan and support from an expert coach anytime, anywhere. Visit anytimefitness.com to try Anytime Fitness for free. Start to train for your life. Terms, conditions, and restrictions apply. See website for details.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day. And that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
I need support staff to clear the room. Stand up and walk now.
Hello and welcome to The Watch. My name is Chris Ryan. I am an editor at TheRinger.com, and joining me on the other line, brought to you by Ellaville, it's Andy Greenwald!
I wish we went back to that era of medicine advertising.
Yeah.
You know, where it's just like...
Someone standing in a meadow just like, God damn, this pill makes me feel awesome.
No, it's just like, take this and you'll be Betty Draper.
Yeah.
You know?
I wish.
And I think that also, we're talking about Many Saints of Newark, but that I'm not sure because the camera didn't linger on it, but it didn't seem like there was an entire page where they were like, taking Ellaville may cause your prostate to explode sometimes.
I don't think they just
like, there wasn't
that kind of stuff back in the late 60s and early 70s. You know, they were just like Marlboros. Love it or leave it.
Seemed to be good. Yeah, that's right.
Andy, we are going to be talking, obviously, that if you've watched Many Saints of Newark, you know what that joke is about. And I hope you have watched Many Saints of Newark, because that's what Andy and I are talking about for the first half of today's podcast. A lot to chop up there with David Chase's foray back into the world of Sopranos. But Andy, we also have, in the second half of the show, a very cool interview that I can't wait to listen to, but I did not do. This is something that you did.
Yeah, I just want to give people a heads up. We'll talk a little bit about it at the end of the pod right before the interview begins, but I had the chance to talk to a director and producer named Tom Vitale, who was one of the key architects of Tony Bourdain's TV shows. He started working as a tape logger back in the A Cook's Tour days, worked on No Reservations, directed many, many, many of the very best episodes of Parts Unknown. He's written a memoir about his time traveling the world with Tony called In the Weeds. It's an extremely, extremely good memoir, extremely good book. Absolutely essential reading, in my opinion, for anyone who loved Tony from a distance, like you and I did. It's really eye-opening and humanizing and powerful in a lot of amazing ways. And I was really grateful that Tom came on and had a very open and also emotional conversation with me about it. It's a long conversation, but I think it's really good listening if you, like Chris and I are, if you are a fan of Tony Bourdain. So that's waiting for you at the end of the pod.
Yeah. So obviously today we watched Many Saints of Newark over the weekend, and we wanted to have kind of continue our conversation that we started last Thursday about The Sopranos and the legacy of The Sopranos. I highly recommend people check out Justin Sales' appearance on The Big Picture. I thought Sean and he did a really good job talking about the the movie, but mostly like I really loved their conversation about their top 5 episodes. I was kind of curious if you had a top 5 in your back pocket, or do you have a running top 5? You're not a big list guy, honestly.
No, and I don't. I also feel like the Jets won this weekend. We don't need to keep fluffing Sean. Like, he's fine. But I don't. And one of the things that's going to lead into our conversation about the movie is I won't even pretend to have a episode by episode granular memory of the show.
Sure. I mean, obviously I don't either. Yeah.
But like Whitecaps, I guess, would be the number one, just because of because like I feel like Whitecaps would be your favorite because everyone knows Chris loves depictions of couples having screaming fights, generally on a beach. Whitecaps is beach adjacent, or it's like by a body of water.
So I went through Justin's list and I realized like I've seen more Sopranos than I've probably given myself credit for. I just don't really have a coherent like through line for it, because I think I watched some half-heartedly. I maybe missed episodes. I mean, it was just like much more of a kind of, quick. It was just like a more temporal experience for me, where it was like, oh, it's on and I'm watching it. But I definitely watched the last two to 3 seasons as they happened, for sure.
But I think that you're maybe inadvertently making an important point, which is that The Sopranos was still a TV show in a slightly older conception of it, which is to say, there were seasons where a certain thing happened for the season, right? There was the Joey Pants season, or the Steve Buscemi season, or the season where Tony is in the coma thinking he's Kevin Finnerty. It wasn't Breaking Bad. Like, there wasn't necessarily a tick-tock of a descent towards what the show was going to be. And I think that affects our memory of it, because in a certain way, we could talk about it like we talk about like Justified. We're like, oh, the Margot Martindale season was amazing and I loved that, or whatever, right? It doesn't lend itself to the kind of snowball gradually rolling downhill, which is, I think, something we've come to expect TV shows to be. As a pivot, if I may.
Sure.
I think that that's also kind of why I'm excited to, one of the many reasons why I'm excited to talk about the Many Saints of Newark film with you, because when watching it, I mean, I didn't do a rewatch, you know what I mean? And so then later, when I'm reading Alan Sepinwall's incredibly dense, essentially recap of the film, and he's just like, oh, well, that was Jackie Aprile that Tony is slapping at the end.
Yeah.
And then later this, I'm like, okay, it didn't affect I recognize Holston's. I knew what that meant canonically, but I didn't remember the way Tony talked about the legendary Dickie Moltisanti in the show. And I don't think that affected my engagement with it, but I think that it speaks to the larger challenge of a project like this.
So let me ask you the question, which is a 2-part question, of course, about this movie, is what did you think of the movie and what did you think of it as a Sopranos fan?
I want to start by saying this. I loved watching the movie. I was thrilled watching the movie. I really enjoyed it. I thought that it was engaging and entertaining and surprising and compelling. And I thought it had some really knockout performances, especially Vera Farmiga, but Alessandro Nivola as well. I also, this probably won't surprise people, found it, even as I ultimately found some of the storytelling to be lacking, I found the struggles that the movie seemed to be having to decide on what story it was going to primarily tell really spoke to the larger problem of franchise entertainment in the year 2021 and the porous boundary between film and movie and fan and creator that we exist with. So we can get into the specific weeds of what was good, what wasn't good, what worked, what didn't work. But my general takeaway is that this is a worthwhile film on a number of levels. And actually, I think we're going to be thinking of it and looking back on it and talking about it in a more significant way as the years go on, because whether it's in 2023 or 2030, when whomever is greenlighting projects for HBO Max Peacock and they greenlight Sopranos kids, like Lil Wise Guys or whatever, and David Chase is no longer around to, whether because he's retired, hopefully living happily on a beach somewhere, or just shuffled off the mortal coil or listening to Journey, to object to it or to be involved in it, it's not going to have the same kind of, is this an art film or is this fan service struggle that we saw so plainly on the screen here? It's going to be a different era. And so I think this movie is a really significant benchmark in the road of where this stuff is going. But maybe we should begin just by talking about its merits as both a movie and as a Sopranos continuation before we talk about what I think it has to say about the industry.
The industry, sure. I enjoyed aspects of the movie. I think in a weird way, the film felt really kind of divided up. Like it was almost like, you know, it was sitting in a glass lock container with lots of little like bento boxed out, you know, and there were parts of it that I really enjoyed. I really, really loved Bernthal in this movie. And part of me wished that this was Tony Soprano's father's story, which I know had initially been something Chase had kicked around. There are parts, and I loved Corey Stoll in the movie. I really liked the depiction of that relationship. I thought that it just tried to do one to two things too much, and I don't know which was the thing that kind of tipped it over. I think obviously Leslie Odom's storyline in this movie is admirable and interesting, but also I don't know how it like really fits into the Soprano story in general, or not the Soprano story like the TV show, but this movie. Like even this story that they were telling, I thought that it was a case where I feel like it should have been one or the other, and it didn't really resonate for me. But at the same time, there were plenty of things to like in it. I thought Ray Liotta was incredible in the movie.
Oh my God. Yes.
And and like you, I also thought Farmiga was extraordinary. And I guess I just kept kind of seeing things that I really liked and wishing that either this was a season of television and we got to spend 3 hours with Livia Soprano or Sally Moltisanti or Harold McBrayer or whoever, or that they had just decided to make a 2-hour film very, very much skewed towards one of these characters, you know, and that whoever was around them, but that it wasn't this sprawling depiction of late 60s, early 70s Newark.
Even just talking about this is drenched in pathos for me. Like this is an emotional conversation about why things get made the way they get made. There are 3 distinct projects on display in the 120 minutes of this film. One project is about Harold and Black life in Newark.
Yeah.
And not just a legitimate storyline, but a really fascinating storyline and one deserving of its own movie or television series. And Leslie Odom was great. And I always like Leslie Odom, but I'm a Hamilton guy. I was trying to think how many opportunities I feel like I've had to see him just act. And he's magnetic and charismatic, and he was awesome. The second story is a gangster movie about Dickie Moltisanti in Newark in the late 60s, early 70s. And one that I think potentially is suffused with the same kind of, you know, self-loathing and regret and psychological layers that David Chase brings to all of his projects, including The Sopranos. And that also is a worthwhile story. And there are moments when the movie is focused on that I was completely all in. The third piece is a Sopranos prequel about Tony and who made Tony. And again, there are many, many worthy aspects in that movie. I would even argue that the Livia scenes, both with Talia Balsam as the school counselor, or principal, or psychologist, whatever she was, and then the hamburger scene. I mean, the hamburger scene is a Hall of Fame scene. Screenwriting, performance, it's an incredible scene. And all of watching The Sopranos is richer because that scene exists. But these 3 projects don't really have anything to say to each other, don't naturally hang together. And so what I'm talking about pathos in the entire experience of watching it and talking about it, and maybe I'm projecting to a degree because, you know, I've met him, I've sat with him, and I've heard many interviews with him, with David Chase. I think that he is legitimately motivated to tell story number 1 and story number 2 and wanted to find a way to tell those things. The only way he could do them was if he did story number 3. As a price he had to pay for entry, like yes.
You think that they were just like, if you want to do, because this was originally, I think the origin story from what I gather of Many Saints of Newark is that Chase was interested in telling a story about 4 guys living in Newark who joined the National Guard to avoid going to Vietnam and wind up getting pulled into the riots. So that was there was a germ of that idea.
Yep.
And then he had always been interested in the Junior and Johnny and Dickie's time in the mafia.
That generation, yeah.
And that
the generation that Tony says he felt like in his memory they had it all and he came in too late.
And then Tom Fontana had kind of suggested to him that he explore that they had done a like a speaking engagement or a panel, and that Tom Fontana mentioned like you should look into that. And then
Tom Fontana, the TV creator of Oz, and
worked on Homicide: Life on the Street, and it was incredible showrunner. And then there's the Easter egging of it. There is here's all the characters who would later grow up to be iconic Sopranos characters, and I think that's where the Sopranos dinner theater aspect comes in, where it's Billy Magnuson as Paulie Walnuts, essentially doing like a. Sorry, my microphone just cut out for some reason. It's Billy Magnuson doing Paulie Walnuts, and it's convincing, but it also feels a little bit like karaoke, and
the John Magaro as Silvio as well, which I loved it, but it's broad, as was Silvio.
Yeah, I think the idea that he had to, that somebody who's basically responsible for one of the most beloved and discussed, and I would imagine at this point, watched TV series of all time, has to still pay the piper is pretty interesting.
It is his definitional thing. I mean, but I think this is also how his mind has always worked. I referred to it at the end of last week. But if you listen to him on Mark Maron, he's like, I sold out when I took a 8-year deal with Universal to write Rockford Files. Like I'm nothing.
Yeah.
I sold out. I gave up my dreams. And that's written into all of this. And I think it's a lot more complicated than it is, than it sounds when I say like, he had to do X to do Y. It's never that simple. I think that no one creates something, makes something without finding their way to loving it and being enthusiastic about it. This was not a painful exercise. But
well, I was just going to ask you, don't you think it's interesting that the sellout scene is the best scene in the movie?
Which one?
If the scene where it's like, this is how Tony and Livia used to interact with one another when she was a young mother and he was a teen.
Yes.
And it's like, here you go, Sopranos fans. You guys want to know about this shit. Here you go. And it's like, offhandedly, this is the best scene in the movie.
I love that you said that, because this is also the pathos at the root of this entire project to me, which is David Chase, 76-year-old man, wants to make movies. It's been that way since he was a teenager outside of Newark. He wants to make movies. I struggle saying this aloud. Maybe he makes better TV shows. I really liked Not Fade Away, the movie that he did make when The Sopranos ended. John Magaro, early great performance by Julia Garner. Gandolfini is in it. I recommend people check it out. My takeaway from it, which I think I memorialized on this podcast after seeing it, was I kind of would have liked it more as a TV show. There was a lot more meat on those bones, and I think it would have benefited from it. Watching this movie, what you realize, the genius of The Sopranos wasn't the efficacy with which, or the efficiency with which it sketched out the structure of mob life, or brought to life a mob hit or something. It was all the digressions in between, all the mundanity, all the here to there-ness of everything, and the bullshit that you have to do on top of the bullshit that you have to do for work. And that's when the genius came from. And this movie, in its desire to be a movie and to take 3 different distinct ideas and get it done in 2 hours, which I read somewhere else is what Chase insisted that it be, doesn't give us much opportunity to have those beautiful digressions that define The Sopranos. It's really noteworthy that there's this moment, the moment when Dickie is talking to his uncle and he says that he's a good person because he's coaching blind baseball. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, the movie comes alive in this nervy, weird, surreal way. And that's Chase too. Chase loves the surreality and the digressions, right? That's him as a filmmaker and as a storyteller. But here it felt almost out of the blue because we weren't in that mode. That's not what this was. This was a quote unquote capital letters movie. And there's a struggle there. You could also just see it simply from a plot perspective. Uncle Junior's resentment about everything, about his brother, particularly about Dickie Moltisanti, leads to the most dramatic event in the movie, which is he whacks his own capo, or, essentially, as he says, think of me as your brother. That needed a season. It needed more than one pratfall and laughter to pay off. You know what I mean? It all, there was so much more there to tell us that story, and we didn't get it.
The point that you made about The Sopranos excelling at depicting the more mundane, everyday kind of grind of just being alive. When I was listening to Justin and Sean, they were talking about an episode that I do love quite a bit called Second Opinion, which is Carm and Junior facing out various, like the medical problems, obviously Junior's diagnosis and everything. And so much of that episode is about the clerical work that goes into trying to get medical treatment in the United States and all the stuff that you have to sort of figure out. And so many episodes of this show, I think, do excel. When people talk about novelistic storytelling, I think the assumption is that it's this one great story being told over a long period of time. And it's sort of, everybody, we laugh when we call it The Wire Dickensian, but that's kind of like what I usually think of. But, when you read a good, deep, well thought out book, novel, piece of literary fiction, and, you get to this section in, I don't know, like a Jonathan Franzen book or a Thomas Pynchon book or something, and there's just like this digression about birds or, cheeseburgers or whatever. That's novelistic. Novelistic is we have the time to sort of just dig into what I'm interested in talking about. And it's riffs. It's riffs about being alive that come together into something. And I do think that that's what The Sopranos was great at, was having all these kind of like, here's how you wind up having empathy for people who are grotesque, is you just see them do things that you also do.
Exactly. It's so funny. Chase has repeatedly said recently, again, repeated it, that he hoped that HBO would reject the Sopranos pilot so he could buy it back, shoot 20 more minutes and submit it to the Cannes Film Festival and be done with it. But what's underneath all of this is the Mafia movie exists. We understand its contours and what can be done with it, and it's been done. The beauty of The Sopranos is that it wasn't a movie. And so, to use a completely different 70s movie, I'm sure there's an analogy from The Godfather I could grab, but I'll use The Godfather. I was going to use The Graduate ending because I love it. But the end of Godfather 2, right, the door closes and the music swells. Right. And we understand with an incredible grace and economy of images and music, what this means emotionally for who Michael Corleone has become and what it means for Kay and this fake dream of being able to be a normal American family, all of that. The Sopranos is interested with what happens when someone in the room that the door closed in has to go to the bathroom.
Right.
Or wants a snack. Like, that's when it stops being this grand cinema and just becomes life. And that, as to your point, is why we empathize for these monsters, because they also have to go pick up the dry cleaning or whatever. And I miss that in the movie. And I would say also, and this is also tough to articulate, if not even a little bit unfair, is that I think the argument for someone like Chase to either make a movie or write a novel, if that was where he was going with it, would be to more cleanly and precisely articulate and distill his singular auteurist vision for this property, right? Like, even in the prestige golden age of these TV shows, like Vince Gilligan, David Chase, David Simon, they would all tell you it's a collaboration.
Sure.
And so maybe the reason to get another bite at the apple with The Sopranos for Chase is, I'm just going to lean and mean, tell you this story. I'm going to write it and direct it. I'm going to show you how I see it. And due to, unfortunate family health situation, he couldn't direct the film. And so he brings in Alan Taylor, who is a very accomplished director and directed many episodes of The Sopranos and Thor: The Dark World, but we're not talking about that. And the movie is beautifully directed, and there's a lot of really nice, period production details, and the camera movement is great. And people are talking about shots like, the flames behind Harold when he opens the door. I mean, it's taking advantage of the canvas. But again, I don't know if it's impossible for me to say that I'm not just saying this because I know, but it did feel like work for hire. I didn't feel that there was a particular point of view to the telling of the story, which, as we said, is 3 stories. And I kind of wish that Chase had been given the chance to just show us what he meant with all of this. Literally, I'm sure he was there, he was involved, he signed off on everything, he's proud of the movie. And I don't mean to disparage Alan Taylor, who did a good job, but those little side things that interested us in The Sopranos, I mean, those come from Chase. So the pinky swear from the casket or the surrealism of the baseball thing. What's that version of this? And I don't think we were able to see it.
I was wondering whether or not you felt like the movie lacked some of the signature ambiguity that the show traveled in.
There's just not room for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do feel that, and which is a shame because I think that look, like Leota. Let's just go through it quickly. Like
that was one thing I did think was pretty ambiguous is Sally. You know,
that was very Sopranos.
That felt like I'm not really sure this is happening. You know, I think that maybe this is also like, is he talking to the ghost of the man of his father that he just killed, who is now, achieved some sort of enlightenment on the other side? There's several mentions of voices from the other side, that when Chrissy is born,
there's the whole Christopher conceit,
and
at the
whole
beginning,
Christopher conceit, but also the old lady says when Tony holds him and he doesn't like it, like he's just like, babies are bringing messages from the other side.
Know.
So obviously this is a movie in which we can speak across the great divide of death to one another. The Sally interactions felt very purgatorial to me or something. Like they felt like this was a guy reckoning with his sins with maybe his defense attorney, but also maybe the judge, this Buddhist jazz loving twin of his father. Yeah.
I love that. I also just loved like Leota in the beginning when he's playing the father is doing such big business.
Yeah. He's
doing the Henry Hill laughing meme that you can see on Twitter every so often, just as a full late life performance. He almost looks like he's in Sin City, like he's wearing the Mickey Rourke CGI, whatever. And then when he shows up as the other character, I was like, oh, he still got it. Like, not just because he was leaner and like less affected, but like he was so dialed in as another person that it was just great seeing him flex his acting chops like that. And Gandolfini's kid, I mean, is a good actor and had, a very compelling and empathetic kind of broken sweetness to him. And just it's a physical embodiment and manifestation of what you're saying the movie is teasing out, that there is a connection from one side of life to death and the other. It's actually happening with this young man playing the young version of his late father. I thought that was kind of moving and powerful. I thought Nivola was great. He rarely gets a chance to shine like this. And it's a really heavy and strong leading performance, but you kind of are left wanting more of all of it. You want more of these performances. You want more of the genuine emotion and surreality, and you just kind of want more of the world, because it's such a compelling one.
I wanted to, if you want to get into, I mean, if you want to keep talking about certain aspects of the film or whatever, I'm happy to. I do have a question for you though that is a little bit more industry based.
Yeah, I'm ready to make that pivot.
So this film did not do well at the box office.
No.
And I'm sure it did quite well on HBO Max. At least anecdotally, it felt like many people, almost everybody I knew checked it out this weekend. But in tandem with it not doing well at the box office, David Chase also signed another overall deal with.
Yes, he did.
And a development or an overall with HBO. You could read that a couple of different ways. Like I'm obviously have no idea like what goes into something like this, but it could be thanks for doing that, David. Here's the overall deal. Maybe you have something else you'd like to do for us. We'd love to. It could be maybe we've just discovered that this is what people want. And if you want to be in charge of it, rather than, like you said, Andy, one day it just becomes a Terrence Winter project, or it becomes, I'm just speculating, throwing out names of people who are involved in The Sopranos, but it becomes, somebody else's baby. If you still want to be the person who oversees all of this, then here's your opportunity. We'd love to be in business with you. And obviously there is a huge, huge market for this stuff. There is just given the amount of content that was made around the Many Saints of Newark release, there is clearly still a huge audience for this story in some capacity.
Let's start from the top. I have no insider knowledge of the parameters of this deal, the payout, the expectation for work, any of it. Full disclosure, I share an agent with David Chase, but I do not share details. I don't know anything about anything. But it does strike me, it strikes me as relevant, a conversation we had a few weeks ago about how HBO does business or historically did business versus the way the newer streamers do business. And not to compare it to La Cosa Nostra, but I do think that HBO has a history of rewarding its talent, of keeping its talent close, and of just staying in business. And I think that you described it very well, which is they want more Soprano stuff. There's no question. They also respect David Chase as the creator and the capo de tutti capo of this whole thing. They also know that they owe him, for making the network, for driving so many subscriptions, and maybe even for, sucking it up and making this movie to some degree. Also, he's a genius. And I don't think there are any strings attached, but if he has ideas, they spent years developing a project that he talked about on the podcast with me, 8 years ago or whatever, about the early days of Hollywood. It doesn't seem to be alive anymore, but they were very engaged in developing that as whatever it wanted to be, if that was his passion. So I think that it's the right thing for everybody, and hopefully something exciting, or just hopefully anything comes of it, because we want more of his content in our lives. How the movie did, look, this is also why Jason Kilar's strategy of putting everything on HBO Max was ultimately protective of filmmakers in a way that I think they bristle at, but there aren't any bombs anymore because of it. Every headline about The Sopranos prequel makes $5 million at the box office against a $50 million budget. The second sentence is, but as we just did now, it probably maybe drove subscriptions or interest on HBO Max, and we'll never know. So there goes the it's a failure conversation. You can't
I guess
poke at it.
With the stories, including ones we've referenced about young people embracing The Sopranos, young people discovering The Sopranos, I suppose that the hope is that there would be a wave of younger people who are already engaged with this, like watching the movie or I suppose signing up for HBO Max and keeping that subscription. This is the kind of funny thing about making stuff where you're expanding the world of one of your tentpole franchises or one of your tentpole shows or signature shows. I bet most Sopranos fans have HBO.
Yes,
and so it's like weird to think that this would be the evangelist to get people to convert, because it's like, of course I have fucking HBO if I love The Sopranos. Like if I want to rewatch The Sopranos, whether it's my login or my parents or whatever, it's like I obviously am aware. It's not like this is like I've been sitting on these DVDs and now finally I'm going to do it.
I guess a counter to that would be, but maybe you haven't downloaded the HBO Max app. Maybe you're not actively engaged in watching HBO the way they want you to watch it now.
Okay.
And if the only way you can do it is to make sure you have that purple square on your TV or whatever, and this is probably more speaking to our parents' generation wanting to engage with a movie without going to a theater, but I think that is a piece of it that is tough to quantify the monetary value of. But I think that the tougher conversation to be had about the movie's relative success or failure is that this is what happens when you try to split the difference and please everyone. Again, anecdotally, I don't think this is what the new generation of Sopranos fans or even the obsessive Sopranos fans wanted.
Mm-hmm.
I think they wanted more Sopranos. I think they wanted the full young Tony story, if that's what it was going to be, to tell us the Peter Parker because we love our Spider-Man comics. Like, that's what people wanted. That is absolutely what HBO and Warner Media advertised. The posters, you can see the bottom half of Nivola's face, but no one knows who that is. And it just says, who made Tony Soprano?
Mm-hmm.
And then the word Sopranos and the logo. The name of the movie is almost negligible.
It's Many Saints of Newark, a Sopranos story, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would imagine, I don't have access to this, but I imagine the number of people who started this and turned it off is large. There's probably still value in that for HBO Max, but it is not the thing that everyone wants. So you end up with this thing you end up with this kind of Frankenstein that is disappointing to the Sopranos obsessives, who are the richest source of potential revenue for the company if they remine this terrain. And I think you also disappoint people like us who would be kind of excited and interested in an original David Chase film about the late 60s in New Jersey. Everyone gets a little bit satisfied and a little bit ticked off, and then where are we? And I think that's kind of a bummer. But I think that this is what I was alluding to at the beginning. I just think it's fascinating because I don't think this moment where these corporations are going to be beholden to the creators, I think that moment is fleeting. I think we're not far away from a point where the algorithm gods at Netflix are like, if they were running HBO or HBO Max, they would come to whomever and say, it's not just that Game of Thrones is popular on our service. The times when the dragons ignite people like fucking Kenny Rogers roasters,
right?
That's the part people like. So we are not saying they like your vision. We're saying they like it when people go up in flames and
I
scream.
think that's also why, I mean, I do think that's happening though, because that's why so many shows have such convoluted timeline mechanics. You know what I mean? I think that is, they saw people losing their minds and becoming obsessive about, you know, what's John's story? What is R plus, you know, like
right.
all that stuff. And they were like, oh, okay, like we need to engineer that kind of interest in our shows. So let's make a show that's entirely about that mystery box, or entirely about that dragon, or entirely about this person's destiny.
I just think that this is an example of where we are with culture. I don't know if this is exactly a film. I don't know if it's a TV show. I think it's content. And I think it's content in the same way Marvel Universe stuff is content. I think it's much more high-minded, and it's a bridge between the old way of doing things and the new way of doing things, but it has too many masters to please, too many cooks in the kitchen, and too many goals, you know? And ultimately, you feel, I mean, there's a mid-credit sequence, you know? There is a Leslie Odom spinoff here.
In this,
You get Gandolfini back. You can make that show or make that movie. It's all still in play. And I would be surprised if some of this wasn't already in development, or at least, you know, PowerPoints are being organized to show David Chase that it's all possible. I just go back to a fundamental belief I have is that a creator's relationship to the creation ought to be fundamentally different than a fan's relationship to the creation. And going backwards, revisiting prequels, it just puts everyone in a box and upends the natural order of things. And that's why, like, in terms of things that have been successful, I think it's very few. I think Twin Peaks: The Return, for example, is a masterpiece, but it's a masterpiece because David Lynch was
it's Lynch's. It's Lynch's.
Yeah, Lynch is like, oh, I'm interested in a couple things. It's not answering the questions that you used to have or servicing things that you used to like and doing them again. It's just because Lynch was like 30 years later, was like, oh, or 25 years later, oh, I want to do this. And it was rapturous, but it was not popular like the first season of Twin Peaks was, when everyone in America was like, who killed Laura Palmer? That time is gone. But it's a different era now in terms of how willing corporations are to let questions like that die or engagement like that dissipate.
Andy, it's about time we get into your interview with Tom Vitale. I was wondering if you wanted to kind of give any more context to the interview, or what you were thinking.
First of all, I just think that this is really important listening and reading if you are a fan of Parts Unknown or No Reservations, because how the sausages got made is something that we don't really know a ton about. We just sort of celebrate the genius of it. And I neglected saying this in the interview. I should say it now. I mean, Tom made multiple hours of Emmy award-winning television, just a incredibly talented producer and director, responsible for some of our favorite and some of the most memorable and intense episodes that Tony did, including episodes in Libya and Borneo and all over the world, and some of the more challenging locales. I also have to say, this book, it's called In the Weeds, it's going to be published tomorrow, October 5th, by Hachette, is jaw-dropping. It's a jaw-dropping book. If you are, like we are, a big fan of Tony Bourdain, you may be aware that his longtime assistant, Laurie Woolever, has written or compiled an oral biography that was published last week called Bourdain, an oral biography. And I'm almost done with it. And it's a really also eye-opening and compelling and engaging book that tells you, Tony's life from the perspective of his family and loves and friends and colleagues. It's also, like many oral biographies, haunted by the absence at the middle of it. We can't really know him. We just get a lot of voices telling us about some things about him. This is not the case with In the Weeds. I don't know where your head is at with it. I'm actually curious, Chris, before we get into the interview, because one of the things reading this book made me feel was complicit. When Tony died, a narrative quickly formed for selfish reasons, but I think on one level, but also decent reasons and accurate reasons about Tony's incredible gift that he was to the world, about his humanity and his empathy and his growth. And I felt kind of complicit because, as discussed in the book and as I discussed with Tom, when he died, they still owed CNN some shows. And so the decision was made to make 2 posthumous shows. One was called Crew Love, about the people who made the show, and one was going to be called Bourdain's Legacy. And I start the interview with Tom talking about this because when those 2 things went on the whiteboard, Tom was like, I have no idea who Tony is to everyone else. I only have these intense experiences. I'm going to go do Crew Love. And Morgan Fallon, another director, took on Bourdain's legacy and asked me to be on that episode. And I was so honored to do it. And I think back and I'm on there being like, Tony was this, Tony was that, Tony did this. But I didn't know him. I didn't work with him. I met him a couple times, and I don't think what I said wasn't accurate, but it kind of robbed this incredibly complicated, charismatic person of a lot of his humanity, which wasn't always pretty. And so reading Tom's book, where you really see what it was like to work with him, how difficult he could be at times, how needy, how troubled, I just kept saying, of course, because he was a full human. And that was what people liked about him. But we kind of have whitewashed a lot of that. And so some of the things that Tom gets into are painful to read and still painful for Tom, as you'll hear. But even the negative things kind of made me love and appreciate Tony Bourdain more because it was a fuller picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny that we're having this conversation after we talked about The Sopranos, because in some ways, the total television oeuvre of Anthony Bourdain is not unlike The Sopranos to me, in that I think that there are hours and hours and hours and hours of just like really, really good nuts and bolts entertainment. Here is a cool place. Here is a funny line. I'm going to eat a bowl of noodles that you wish you had. Here's how I did it. And you're just like, God damn it. I could just watch, I could plan vacations around his shows for the rest of my life and go broke trying and probably have a very fulfilling experience doing that. And then underneath of that was also a guy with a crew of people who was never complacent about making quote unquote food and travel TV and kept pushing and kept trying to find deeper stories and tell those stories in increasingly cinematic ways, in terms of, especially towards the end, where he was doing these homages to spaghetti westerns or homages to George V. Higgins novels or homages to Fellini and a black and white episode and Wong Kar-wai tributes, and really exploring what you could do with the format. And so that those two things of just making the peanut butter and jelly sandwich and then sprinkling truffles on it from the top and putting it in a slow roaster. I don't even know where I'm going with this.
Love it.
Strained metaphor. But so I've been thinking a lot about the process of what it must have been like to make that. And I have to admit, it's never really occurred to me. It's never really occurred to me who made that show, because whether you call it egomaniacal or whether you call it just a function of just pure star power, when you watch Anthony Bourdain's television, you're not really thinking about anything but Anthony Bourdain, sometimes at the expense of the places he visited.
Yeah, and I think that what's really fascinating about Tom's book is he grapples with that disparity. The things that made the show absolutely unique and irreplaceable also made it incredibly challenging in a lot of ways, and not healthy in a lot of ways too, in terms of work-life balance, or in terms of addictive personalities, in terms of, are you traveling to something or running away from something?
Sure.
The kind of allegiance, that almost cult-like allegiance that an entire enterprise built on the charisma of one person can create, and how unhealthy those relationships down the line can be. And so the version of Tony that emerges from Tom's book just feels so real. He was incredibly kind and generous and thoughtful, but he was also manipulative and petty and made life really hard for people a lot of the time. And I'm just sort of struck by, and you'll hear me wrestle with this and be grateful about it and kind of not net out anywhere, I think, in the conversation personally. But when we covered Parts Unknown, if we covered it, on our show, on this podcast, we would, we still talk about the Houston episode or other episodes that were meaningful for us, but we never put it on our year-end list because, for me anyways, when I was a critic, I was like, well, it's different.
Sure.
This isn't scripted TV. But what was really disconcerting to me about reading In the Weeds was the realization of how much I invested in Tony like I would invest in a TV character. The narrative of him as a screw-up, built in these bullying, abusive, drug-riddled kitchens that he was, so thrilled to be a part of. And then over 20 years, traveling the world and becoming more and more human and empathetic. Part of that's true, but that's also a TV character narrative. Mm-hmm. It's never one direction. It's never a straight line. It's messy. And I hadn't held any space for that reality with someone whom I, adored.
Which is funny because that's in the TV too. You can watch Bourdain episodes and see man, he is not feeling it this week.
Yes, and he would be like that. And so to talk to Tom or to read the book, I mean, you'll get really funny stories about what it's like to have Obama or to arrange a cooking sequence or what Zamir was really doing in Romania. All that's there. So it's catnip for a casual fan. But just fundamentally, like, and I talked to Tom about this too, so we won't step on it. But like when I interviewed Tony, he was there 15 minutes early, which according to Tom meant he was late. Like that's how considerate he was of other people. And yet they are in far-flung Malaysia or whatever, and they've spent 5 hours setting up a restaurant shot. And if Tony's in a bad mood, he tanks the whole scene or he keeps them waiting. He won't participate. He won't dance for them, And that push-pull is so compelling. I guess we can get into it. I guess I'll just say we talked briefly about it in the interview, but you got to read the book to hear the full stories. All the stuff that's happened, all the questions I think fans have about Tony, about the aftermath of his passing, what was going on, psychological state, that's all in the book, and then some. Tom does what I think some casual fans would want it to do, although he does it while drunk. He flew to Italy, invited Asia Argento to lunch, bought a bottle of whiskey, got them both drunk, and asked her if she was responsible for his passing. I mean, that's in the book, and I talked to Tom about it. There's another jaw-dropping revelation near the end of the book that Tom and I talk about too that I won't step on, but it's really something. And I think that Laurie Wolliver's book deserves a lot of attention in your time. I'm having a great time reading it, but don't sleep on Tom Vitale's book. It's a really powerful memoir in its own right, in addition to being an incredible window into who Tony Bourdain was. Okay, enough build up. In the Weeds is going to be published by Hachette Books on October 5th by Tom Vitale. Here's me talking to Parts Unknown director-producer, the Emmy Award-winning Tom Vitale.
This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. New Year's resolutions are fun the first couple of weeks. Then you kind of maybe conveniently forget about them halfway through January. No shame. It happens to us all. But this year I have a foolproof plan, at least when it comes to saving money. Just switch to Mint Mobile and you're done. Goal accomplished, because for a limited time, their wireless plans are $15 a month when you buy a 3-month plan. The great thing about Mint Mobile is there's no jaw-dropping monthly bills or unexpected overages, and all plans come with unlimited talk and text. Get this new customer offer today at mintmobile.com/watch. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
I am so excited now to be joined by Tom Vitale, who for many years was the director and producer of Tony Bourdain's TV shows No Reservations and Parts Unknown. And he is now the author of In the Weeds, Around the World and Behind the Scenes with Anthony Bourdain. It'll be published by Hachette Books on October 5th. It is a truly remarkable book. And Tom, thank you so much for joining me to talk about it.
Thanks again for having me.
So I obviously we'll get into it, but I did just want to begin by saying I think the book is remarkable, not just for what it reveals about the making of a phenomenal and beautiful and impactful show, one of my favorites, but also what it says about Tony himself. There's a famous adage about printing the legend when you have a choice. And what I was really moved by in reading your book was your choice to do the opposite. This is a book that acknowledges the legend that's grown around Tony over his many professional years in the public eye, but it also fills in the other half, which I felt was kind of a crucial missing other half. Learning things about Tony that were rougher or maybe not as camera ready, it didn't make me admire him less. It actually made me love him and maybe understand him and mourn him a little bit more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I didn't really know the public Tony very well. I just knew sort of the real Tony, and they were two sides of the same coin. But yeah, he was, I thought, always much more interesting off camera than what made it to the shows.
I couldn't get over this. I've been telling people that as I was reading your book, I just kept stopping and saying, of course, out loud, because it did feel like filling in something that one had the sense of, but never could really fully know or understand to the degree, of course, that you did with your proximity. We'll return to that. I guess I kind of wanted to begin, if you don't mind, where the book begins, which is on June 8th, 2018. Could you describe a little bit, as you do in the book, where you were, what you were preparing to do, and how the news reached you?
Yeah, I was home. We were getting ready to leave for India in about a week for another episode, and my phone started ringing very early, and I thought it was my alarm until my landline started ringing too, and that's when I picked it up. and got the news from Chris, who owned the company 0.0. And it was like very sort of surreal way to wake up, kind of a feeling of, I guess, again, surrealness that's lasted to this day in a certain way. It's still kind of hard to wrap my head around the fact that not only is he gone, but, they killed himself.
There was a feeling among, the larger world, people who are fans, who loved him from afar or even knew him a little bit, that this was, it was just the kind of shock that is very difficult to recover from. It is such a deep sense of surprise and shock. And one of the things that I took away from reading the book was that was clearly shared by you and the rest of the inner circle, the group who spent the most time with him on the road. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I don't know any of us who could have seen that coming. It's still, again, very shocking. He just seemed immortal. I'd seen him survive enough, ATV rollovers and misguided stunts and trips on questionable airplanes and that kind of stuff to think that
warthog anuses, which you mentioned in the book as well. I mean, not many people walk away from that.
No, that was pretty much the one thing that got him sick, but he survived that too. I have a terrible fear of flying, which, made the job a little difficult. The only time I wasn't afraid to be on an airplane was when, he was on the same flight, because I knew there was no way it was going to crash.
Right. And just for context, as you talk about in the book, and we'll circle back to this a little bit, but as one of the directors of the show, you were basically off cycle for this episode that's being shot in France. You were not directing that. You were prepared to go off to India for the next one.
That's correct. There were, about three different teams who would have to sort of checkerboard in order to keep the production going throughout the course of the year. So I was just getting ready to leave for India, and he was in France still responding to emails about the edit. Our Bourdain edit was just about to finish up, and it just seemed sort of like business as usual. I had no idea anything was going on.
And in terms of, this speaks to one of the main tensions that emerges in the book, right? Is that there is a incredibly complicated man at the center of this maelstrom, but the maelstrom never stops spinning, right? There's always the next place to go, the next plan, the next scout, et cetera, et cetera. So the communication and the planning was ever present, right? There was no moment even within that where someone in France would have said, "Hey, Tony is this or he is that." There was no that just wasn't the level. That wasn't what people talked about, right? In the scrum of production.
I mean, I understand now that there were, a few sort of warning signs sent back from the team in France that things weren't going well, but that, didn't come to me. So yeah, it was a very multi-headed beast with a lot going on. Even in the summer when Tony was off for a month, we'd still be getting emails and text messages constantly about episodes coming up. Once it started, I mean, for me, back in 2002, almost in a way, it never stopped until then. Not
too long after the tragic events of that day, you'd write about being back in the 0.0 office in Manhattan and looking at the board again, and there are still episodes that are owed, the episodes to be delivered. And there's a decision made from Chris and Lydia or whoever else was making the decisions at that point that 2 additional episodes will be made without Tony's presence, about him and about the show and the legacy. And the 2 shows were Bourdain's Impact was one, I guess you said it was written on the board, and the other was Crew Love. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited to read the book and to talk to you, not that our roles were in any way equal here, but you in the book without hesitation went straight to Crew Love. And I was, for reasons that I'm still, incredibly honored by, asked to be involved slightly in the Bourdain's Impact episode.
Yeah.
And it's such a, fork in the road moment within the book that I found really noteworthy. And I kind of wanted to drill down a little bit with you because, this is the job of a talking head, I guess, so confidently, Morgan came out here and the crew came to my house, and I was so confidently spoke about a man I had met twice, but also about his, as the title said, about his impact, and about this version of him that was so desperately important to me and to so many other people. And as you alluded to earlier, that was a person that you didn't necessarily know very well or even recognize. You were immediately drawn to the other one. Can you talk about that split? When did you begin to notice that there was a public Tony that was being spoken about and adored for, legitimate reasons, that was not necessarily the person that you knew on a day-to-day basis?
Well, a lot of how sort of impactful and I guess famous he was didn't really occur to me until after he died and sort of in the aftermath of his death, the outpouring of grief. I mean, over the years, I guess that split between the public and the private Tony got bigger and bigger. It was really the same thing. Again, more two different sides of the same thing. What do we spend that 42 minutes of TV talking about? Me or the people I'm visiting? I mean, I think there were roughly 300 episodes of TV he'd made by the end. I mean, quite a while ago, got pretty sick of talking about himself and wanted to turn the camera as much toward other people as possible. And I think that in the process, I don't think it was intentional, but he did kind of, I guess, gain this almost Saint Tony sort of persona, which, I mean, he was a very inspirational leader to all of us. The one that I guess the public knew was a bit more edited for TV.
Right. I think it's important to say that though your book gets into some gnarlier details or experiences or observations about him and his behavior and his struggles, you also don't give short shrift to his generosity and his, and the kindness he was capable of, and, the overall mission that I do think the show accomplished that was so important to him about shining a light on the little guy or girl, whatever the case may be, and championing those stories, always, championing the underdog. Both could be true. He
was a brilliant, magical person.
I think that what was so striking to me, really shook me in reading the book, was realizing how much I personally was invested in the story, how much it mattered to me, that the narrative that I helped spin, good faith, but spin, even on the episode that I was lucky enough to be on, the narrative of a guy who was this sort of, gnarled, broken, struggling ex-junkie who willed himself. And then season by season, we could watch him become more humanist, more global, more kind. It's a TV arc, frankly, and it was a great TV character, but it's not possible. It's not possible for any human being, even the most saintly among us, to just be the one thing. But the importance of that to me was, I never questioned it, honestly, until I read your book.
Yeah, well, again, I really don't see them as separate things. You and I would be very different, off camera when we're at home talking to our friends or family or getting things done. It was a constant fight for Tony to make the kind of TV that he did. It's one of the brilliant things about him, always cutting against the grain. And that, if there is anything that's sort of definitely hidden in the shows, I mean, it's how much of a struggle that was, because that does not happen easy. The layers of network management and convention that he constantly had to challenge to get what he, wanted, which was a different way to tell stories, was not easy. And, anyone who's read Kitchen Confidential will see in there how he leads, a kitchen team to get what he wants. And I think that the Tony that I knew was very similar and very constant to that original Tony in the book. Whereas, again, the public one, I guess, shifted a bit more to become kind of kinder. I mean, we didn't waste time snarking about things quite as much as we did in earlier days. So, but he never stopped doing that.
Right. The idea that you could just sort of, like the industry itself, unlearn all of the bad habits that were put into you in the kitchens, in the old brigade system, that he would suddenly sort of slough them off and become woke in all senses in his own management style. That's just not possible. It's convenient to think about, but there's no way that would have been possible for anyone.
I mean, I think, even when Tony was angry or, delivering, a put down or some tough direction, I mean, he did it so brilliantly. I mean, which I hope I captured in the book. It was just
he's very funny when he's verbally abusing everyone. He's got that.
Yeah.
I mean, you have maybe the best way to put it is you put it quite brilliantly yourself in the book. There's just a sentence that popped out, which is Anthony Bourdain was a great man, even though at times he could be a less successful human being.
Yeah, he had trouble communicating to people he cared about, I think, people close to him. He did that with food, and he, I guess, was a bit more in touch with his anger than love, which was interesting because he really is able to communicate the love so well, through the medium of television or his public persona. But he definitely had a lot more trouble with that in his interpersonal relationships.
Well, let's talk about that in terms of specifics. So again, in my very limited time with him, one of the things that struck me was he was kind enough to come on my podcast years ago now, 7-8 years ago. And this was after I had insulted him in a piece. Maybe that's why he came on. But he was, 15 minutes early, which I was told later he was for things like that. He was extremely polite.
He was late.
What's that? If he was
15 minutes early, was late.
Right. So that was important to him, and he was incredibly polite and direct and took the time with me, just as I saw him take time. Another time when I saw him, people came up and took pictures, and you write about how he always gave those people time, et cetera. So then when I begin reading your book, and the fact that he would come onto the set of his TV show as the center of it after you and the rest of the crew had, been working for hours to set up the shots and to arrange the everything, literally arrange the everything. And he wouldn't play. He wouldn't play ball. He would pout, or he wouldn't feel like it, or he wouldn't, the behavior was kind of like it was childlike in some ways, the way he described it. And it was your job to kind of tease out of him the things that would make the TV show he wanted to make. That was jarring to me.
Well, he always had a very uncomfortable relationship with the camera. He was really camera shy and did not like the attention, believe it or not. He was just so good at it. So he was always very professional. He was always early. He was very low maintenance when it came to things like creature comforts. I mean, there was no trailer. He would joke about wanting a bowl of only red M&Ms, but I mean, it was just a joke. He asked for almost nothing other than the information that he needed before a scene. And he didn't like to see us setting up because it reminded him that he was on a TV show, which really kind of threw him off his game. If he could just walk in and forget that we were all there, that was the best sort of, scenario for him. He really, and I think that was a part of the magic recipe. Also, the fact that he didn't really want to be on camera, or that he was combative about those things. If he was, I guess, for lack of a better word, easier or more laid back, I mean, the shows wouldn't have had that kind of dynamic energy that he brought to it. So you can't really even take one of those elements away from the magic recipe.
That's the thing. It's unknowable, right? And unanswerable. Like he was, the things that his difficulty is what made the show unique, and his refusal to go along with convention or to play by the rules in any television sense, let alone any management sense, led to, a completely transcendent TV show, but it also had, negative effects.
I wouldn't recommend it as a business model.
Right. So let's talk about your own path to joining this pirate ship, such as it was. And I wonder if maybe your own unconventional path there is one of the reasons why you ended up there. And I think that's one of the questions that the book asks as well. So when you started working on in the edit bay, right, of was it No Reservations?
Tape logger on a cook's tour, actually, right out of college back in 2002. Yeah.
On his very first show on Food Network. So you're there, and within a number of years, you are directing traffic and making life or death decisions in the Congo. How does that work? How does he pull you on board, and how do you pull yourself on board?
Well, yeah, I started off logging the tapes, and from literally right at the very beginning, the first one, you could just see that, or I felt that magic, whatever it was, that was so attractive about Tony. And I mean, I've heard so many times from people that never met him how it really felt like they knew him. And I can certainly say I agree with that. I felt the same way from the very beginning. And then, I stuck around for a while, and just after a couple of years of being in the edit side of things, I used to go to complain to Christy every Friday and tell them how much I wanted to travel. And finally they gave me a chance. And I never stopped traveling with Tony since that was in 2006 on the second season of No Reservations.
What was it that you think you brought that made sense to be a part of this? Because as you said, this was not conventional in any way. The decisions that you make on a dime, as described in the book, in circumstances that most people could not imagine themselves in. What was it about yourself that you think lent itself to this frankly insane at times opportunity?
Well, Tony would talk a mile a minute about very complex things and then jump topics instantaneously without even signposting that he was switching from, one episode coming up to another one. And I think I was fortunately able to keep up to some degree, to a sufficient degree, with the sort of speed at which his mind moved, which then, I guess suited me well once we were in the field and had to make all of these split-second, almost life or death decisions. And as far as how I approach things, I was right out of school when I started working with him, and spent my whole career up to, when he died, essentially working with Tony. So it was one hell of an education.
From reading the book, I think it's safe to assume that one of the most misunderstood things about your job for all those years was that it was some kind of permanent vacation. The stress seems enormous, but also that as things got quote unquote better, the budgets got better, the opportunities got better as you moved from Travel Channel to CNN. I was just really struck by how impossibly challenging shoots like Congo or Iran were. And then also kind of, again, laughing at myself, because no matter where you were, what you went through, who almost died, where the leeches stuck, it ended up on the same box as Buffalo, New York. Not to pick on Buffalo, that was a good episode, but do you know what I mean? It's all shrunk down into the same thing, and it's just like, well, those guys have done it again, on to the next one.
It was scarier than going to the Congo or Libya or any of those places was letting Tony down. And in a place like Buffalo, I think the chance of that happening would have been a lot higher.
Right.
To a certain degree, it's a heck of a lot more difficult to make a show of that quality and intensity in your own backyard than it is to, do it on the other side of the world. I did mostly the international episodes and the kind of the more high risk ones. But I did a few domestics over the years, and I found them actually much more challenging for different reasons. But
it is amazing that you did mostly the international ones when, as you confess in the book, you hate flying and are not an adventurous eater. It is.
Well, Tony was an adventurous eater, but he also did not like flying. He was scared of meeting strangers. He was an incredible germaphobe. So I think for all of us, and I won't speak for other members of the crew, but there certainly are others, it was a constant exercise in facing your fears every single day. And in a way that I think was part of that magic recipe as well.
Well, one of the things that I love, it's a stray detail, but you, and I hope I didn't read the wrong thing into it, but basically that when there was an off-camera dinner in a location, even if it was a location famous for food, it seems like you guys got chicken wings and pizza at the hotel.
That evolved more over the years. But definitely by the end, Tony would joke about fine dining fatigue. We were experiencing, when we were filming, the absolute best of the best, whether it be, high end or the most, the best fish taco street cart. So whatever we ate off camera was not going to compete with that. So it was kind of the go-to. Yeah, it was chicken wings, spaghetti bolognese.
I appreciate that you went to fish taco as your example, though now after having read the book, I know you would not have partaken.
I did not eat much, period, on the shoots. I would lose about 10 pounds on each one, mostly from sort of stress. But I was not in it for the food personally.
we've already made mention of his particular management style, and one thing that comes across in the book is that he's not a Machiavellian figure or necessarily manipulative, but he does seem to be able to zero in on a particular way to manage each of the people in his employ, if that's fair to say. Could you speak about what that dynamic was like with you and how it evolved or maybe didn't evolve in ways that were difficult for you over the many years you were together?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It wasn't until after Tony died that I really had a chance to start processing all of these things, because it was just the way things were. You brought up the 2 episodes that we did to fulfill the contract with CNN after his death. The Crew special was where, believe it or not, I first learned how different he was with other teams, people I'd known for a very long time. And I think we all found that kind of interesting, how much time we'd spent together and not compared notes. I guess just assuming our own version of reality was the version of reality.
Right.
And I don't know, there was, another director who Tony complimented all the time. Compliments were not the way that we really operated overall. There were compliments in the edit. He was when he'd really kind of be complimentary. That was his favorite part of the production process. The field work, could be hard, but he loved telling stories and putting it together and conveying for the audience how it was that he felt when he was there, or how he wanted them to feel. And, that's where he was certainly the nicest, and where I saw his brilliance shine the most. And he was brilliant.
There are, numerous examples throughout the book of, moments when not numerous, but there are examples in the book when he expresses his appreciation for the work you're doing, gives praise. Other times when he's doing the opposite of praise, but clearly there's some affection underneath it. And then there's, and I'm almost loath to bring it up because I feel like it must be traumatic. There's an event that happens in Borneo when he becomes physically violent towards you. And, that was shocking to read. More shocking in some ways is the aftermath, in which, as you write, you were prepared to quit no matter what apology he gave you. And he gives no apology. He says that it'll never be spoken about again. And from what I gather, it was not.
Never was. Tony didn't apologize with words. He apologized for that instance by doing the incredibly painful hand tap tattoo scene that I had wanted for the episode that he had canceled. That was a unfortunate incident, but that happened, many years before the end, and there were a lot of bumps in the road. We worked very closely together for a long time, and it was a very highly stressful job.
But also the job itself, it is one of those reality warping things that I've seen can happen in, with organizations run by a figurehead. You, not me, later use the word cult in the book when everyone's wearing the same sunglasses. But, the production did take on aspects of his preferences or personalities whether it was in terms of, egging people on to do more extreme things, but also a culture that, because of the nature of the stress and the travel, there were pills, there was alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. In the 2 years since, and obviously the book is beginning of the process, and I don't want to, pretend that it's anywhere close to the end, but are you able to process events like that more now and think about where they stand in terms of your relationship with him or what the relationship was?
Yeah, well, I have thought about that a lot, that particular incident. And I think that in a way he was sort of attacking himself, or at least I represented the part of him that had to be on TV. It was this sort of,
right.
He had this terrible fear of clowns, which was actually, as funny as it sounds, and he joked about it, horrifyingly real fear for him. And, I thought again a lot more about that after he died, and it became very clear that that fear came from the fact that, he was forced to be one.
Yeah.
And, the public side of being on TV was really difficult for him, which, is kind of the whole thing. So it's, he had very existentially complicated person.
One of the things that really shocked me in the book was learning that he had never done therapy until near the end of his life. And you know, that idea that has come up in my therapy, you know, the idea that you can't outrun yourself, that wherever you go, there you are.
Well, he made a career of outrunning himself until he didn't.
Yeah. I felt such sadness and empathy for him, that he was, you know, in a sense, blundering through life like that. I mean, that he didn't have that extra tool or extra help, you know, in a way that I think can be so helpful to so many people.
Yeah. He started therapy near the very end of his life, and it I think it was really helping him. He told me that it helped him feel like he wasn't such a bad person, which was a very strange thing for me to hear when he said that, because I would have thought about him as anything but a bad person. I mean, he was my hero. I mean, all these things in retrospect, you know, he joked about throughout the years. But I guess some of them were less of a joke than he, than I interpreted it at the time.
I wondered about other things like you talk in the book, you know, again, with some hindsight about addictive behavior, just that it was just who he was. That's some people are subject to addictive behavior.
True for again, I won't speak for everyone. For me, also on the crew, I mean, maybe part of the reason why, you know, the job fit, it was not a job. It was much, much more than that.
Right. It fulfilled an outsized role in everyone's life. Mm-hmm. And I wondered what that was like, you know, not in terms of drug use, which I think, you know, hard drug use, which was in his past and he had spoken about or written about, but just things that as a viewer, I would flag as someone who watched all three of the shows religiously, every episode, you know, the jujitsu thing, for example, which suddenly not only began to dominate his life, changed his body. And then all of a sudden you have episodes where it's just like, he's just doing this episode to go do jujitsu. You know, so as someone who's been there the whole time, as these sort of waves rock the boat or come at you, what was that like, watching him change, or these things suddenly swamp everything?
Well, I mean, as long as I'd known him, there was always some obsession, and It changed. So things didn't really change. It was just a different obsession. Jiu-jitsu was a particularly hard one to deal with because it was good for him. He really cut down on the smoking as a result of it. And, you know, he got in shape, and it was really great to see him doing something physical like that. It was good for his health. But from a production standpoint, it caused huge complications. He wanted to train no matter where it was that we were. So we had to find a, you know, MMA or BJJ studio somewhere, and then fit in a public class into our production schedule, which usually meant pretty early in the morning. And because he didn't want private lessons, he didn't want to feel like he was, you know, being treated special. On top of that too, I mean, he'd come to location, you know, beat up. Sometimes his fingers would be wrapped in bandages. I mean, so, you know, we had to like film around that. And he loved getting beat up. You know, there was some point where some kind of like skin lesion started growing, which I guess happens from wrestling like that and sweating. And I mean, it's just, you had to film around all of these injuries that he was gaining. And I didn't do, I guess I did one in Rio where Tavia came along to fight. That was the only episode I did that actually had it in the shows. Fortunately, I didn't work on those other ones because I'm sure they would have been more difficult.
Right. When Morgan came, who directed the episode that I was a part of, and I was speaking to him about it, and this is 1 or 2 months afterwards, he was talking about the only thing that he was aware of the fact that Tony seemed to be isolating himself more and more when he wasn't on the road, that he was living, you know, in the Upper East Side and not going out. Particularly in the book, you write, and this is a painful detail, that he would almost was agoraphobic in a hotel room and didn't want to bother anyone. So you were sending food to his room. You've already spoken about how your relationship with him was different and fraught because you were also, you know, you were close to him, but you were also the face of asking him to do things. So that was a complicated relationship. From your perspective, was there anyone, and I'm already questioning the question because this is not meant to be an indictment of anyone or anything. I'm just wondering if in his life, such as it existed outside of making the show, were there people who questioned how healthy the schedule was or the nature of it, the loneliness of it or the isolation of it, despite the constant public demands, whether it was Otavia or Repair or other people, his brother, other people in his life?
Yeah, I think there were lots of people. I mean, myself included. I mean, when he'd be really tired, he'd say, why can't you just take some time off? But he wouldn't. And would get incredibly antsy, even within the context of sitting in a hammock for part of a day. He'd talk about, summer vacations, that 1 month off, like after he'd be very tired at the end of the season. And then he'd have that month off. And by the end of that, he was very anxious and itching to be traveling again. I mean, ultimately, there was no life outside of the show. When your name is on the show, it's all a TV show to a certain degree. And when people did suggest you could do less, there were different attempts at that. Like The Taste, for instance, was sort of one of his attempts to figure out a way that he could have more of a life and, be with his daughter, who he loved very much. And it was kind of a spectacular failure, at least as far as he was concerned. I never saw an episode, but
I feel that was my entry point. It was my absolute decimation of that show that led to my, encountering him. And again, I feel terrible about that because there's a humanity piece of it. And, and I came in being like, this is the antithesis of everything he stands for in the public eye, which I'm sure he was very sensitive to.
You were absolutely right. And you spoke the truth, which is something that he did not get very often. He'd sort of inadvertently created this reality distortion field around him where people wouldn't challenge him on anything. I remember a scene we were filming in Malaysia, and he just kept raving about the black pepper crab sauce, and it was so good. And then afterwards, we went to go film the food prep. The person he's talking to, the local, is also saying, "Yes, this is the best black pepper crab I've ever had." Afterwards, we go to film the food prep, and they said, "We don't even serve black pepper crab here. That wasn't black pepper crab." And so I couldn't believe that. I went to the local person and said, "You were agreeing with him?" Like, he said, "Well, he's the food expert." And so nobody ever challenged him on things. And then, when we would, he would not take it very well. So, and yet he so desperately craved honesty from people. And it was very refreshing for him. Like, people would never disagree with him on camera in a scene. And there was one scene, Portugal, it wasn't going well. Just a boring kind of scene for whatever reason, until Tony made some comment, and the guy across the table from him said, "You're absolutely wrong." And Tony's eyes lit up, and he zoomed in, and then it became this amazing conversation because he was so refreshed by being challenged and hearing the truth.
There's something so painful about this because the more he achieved, the further away from planet Earth he gets. I should be clear, we're having a serious conversation about someone that, that you loved very much and, dominated so much of your professional and your life entirely. There are great stories in the book, and there's hilarious things, that up to and including Jimmy Buffett's Margaritaville. I don't want to undersell what a fun read it is to learn about how crazy it actually was behind the scenes from time to time. But I'd be remiss if I didn't if I didn't end up talking to you about the two moments near the end that are just absolutely jaw-dropping. The first is you write very candidly, and I was totally shocked that this is where we were going. Many people who were fans of Tony and following the story, Ozzy Argento's role in his life is the subject of, totally uninformed gossip and debate constantly, with people having strong opinions. in the book, you write about your own struggle with those questions and thoughts. And then you book a trip to Italy and invite her to lunch and get a bottle of whiskey and get her drunk and point blank ask her what all the, people with Twitter finger bravery can't bring themselves to do, which was, what role did she have or feel that she has in his death? That it's an extraordinary series of events.
Well, so much of my life, I feel in a certain way, has been spent looking for answers. I mean, when we were filming and making the shows, it's always looking for answers to things. When Tony died, I kind of went into a sort of a 2-year period of a really, I'd say, a bad depression and drinking a lot. And right around the time I hit rock bottom, I don't know exactly why or how premeditated it was, but I just booked a ticket going to Italy that same morning and had texted Azia to invite her to lunch and didn't really remember that I'd done it until we landed and I had the response. And I wanted answers as to why Tony had killed himself. And I think that the writing of this book has really, shown me in a certain way, there just aren't answers to some things. And Tony always used to talk about how questions are more important than answers. And the book has definitely been an exercise in appreciating him even more than I did.
That's just what's so striking about that scene, because there's someone who to a lot of people is a hero or a villain or whatever, but at least in your telling of it, she just seems sad and confused. And the blast radius of this is large, and I appreciated that's how you left that moment in that scene. You don't give us any definitive answers or finger pointing whatsoever. That's not possible.
Yeah. I mean, I think that mistakes were made by everyone involved, myself included, during all those years. I don't think that Azia wanted Tony to die.
The second thing that was absolutely jaw-dropping at the very end is, it's almost implausible, in terms of like a third act reveal that you write about discovering a thumb drive that Tony had given you with the explicit instructions not to open, which seems very much like him, I guess, to hand you the thing and then tell you not to do anything with it.
He was always setting traps.
Right. And so who knew what it could be? I mean, maybe, would have put some malware in your computer. Exactly. I'm glad we went to the same place. What it turns out to be instead is an early unfinished draft of almost his version of the book that you ended up writing. And what appears to be, in your words, an honest memoir of what it was like to travel this much for this long.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautifully written. It's very different than other things that he had written. I don't know that he ever would have let it get to publication like that. I'm sure he would have edited it a lot more, or spun things differently, or filled in stories with or filled in other parts with more, I guess, uplifting stories. I don't know. It's definitely a reflection of someone who's in a very kind of dark and lonely place.
Do you, I guess in the years since, do you find yourself wondering what, I guess it's a two-part question. I imagine the answer to the first part is yes, which is, do you ever find yourself wondering how Tony would have reacted to certain moments or events, but then also wondering how show Tony or the show would have responded? And specifically, I'm wondering about the pandemic. I mean, a moment when travel can't exist for a show that is defined by travel and a human being who increasingly, and perhaps unhealthily, was also defined by travel.
I have no idea what he would have done. He would have been very vocal about supporting restaurants, in the travel industry. He would have driven everyone around him absolutely insane, being trapped in any one place. I'd like to think that maybe he could have got a lot of writing done. That manuscript, he had been working on that for several years and really suffering from writer's block and unable to kind of finish it and work. And in fact, at the very end, he kind of wasn't really able to write. There have been other periods. I mean, I was with him when he was writing Medium Raw, and that was also difficult. So it didn't seem that abnormal, but I mean, he would have gotten some great writing done, and maybe figured out a way to be a bit more still and present, which is, you know, I saw over the years, especially in the last couple of years, how much he sort of talked about Eastern philosophy when it comes to, you know, being present and having a calm and quiet mind and not always hearing those voices in your head that criticize and say whatever bad things they were saying to him, that he was kind of always outrunning. Mm-hmm. He was a real germaphobe. You know, on the rare occasion someone on the crew would get sick, they would be banished to a different vehicle and or completely away. So he would not have enjoyed a pandemic.
Which so much unlike the rest of us who have had.
It would have been very difficult for him. But he always rose to every challenge and occasion with such amazing grace. And whatever we can predict that he would have done, he would have been doing something different and better because he was unpredictable and just limitlessly creative.
Can I ask, just as a way to wind up, how are you? I know that's a heavy question, and you know, like with everything you were saying, there's probably not an answer, maybe just more questions. But you know, you are, you know, as much of a main character of this fantastic book as Tony is, and you know, the degree to the empathy that the book creates, and then also just from, you know, knowing a few people in the orbit of what can happen to a solar system when the sun goes away. It's a lot. And I guess I just wanted to check in to see how you're doing at this moment. You've written this book, it's coming out. How are you?
Thank you for asking. Writing the book was not easy. It was really difficult. And I've only quite recently finished it. I can definitely say that I feel in some ways like a bit of a burden is relieved, putting that down on paper and kind of out of my mind a little bit. I find myself, for the first time in years, spontaneously laughing again. And you know, I can cry again, which is good. So jury's out a bit, but I think, you know, I mean, I feel unfortunately and not unfortunately that, I mean, Tony will be a big part of my life and what I think about forever. But things are much better now than they were before and during the writing of the book. Was yeah.
I'm glad. I can only imagine. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I think the book is a real gift.
Thank you.
Honestly, to Tony and his memory, because one thing that is, and I'm sure you've encountered this, you know, and I always feel slightly fraudulent saying this because I met him 2 times, but you know, I loved him, and I miss who he was to me in my life, and you know, in some ways I can't watch the documentary. You know, I can't watch the show right now still, even though I don't have any claim emotionally really to feel that way. And, but I think it's just a remarkable thing for you to have done this work for yourself and for him and for everyone that you worked with, because it's a bigger frame, you know, and I think that he deserved that. I think that one of the reasons why we all feel this way is because there was so much there, and so much of it was complicated and naughty and messy and not easy. And that's the most unconventional thing of all in the world of TV. Mm-hmm. So I think, I don't know. I just think I think you've done a really great thing here.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's honest for better or worse. And much like your article, he really appreciated honesty, and there kind of wasn't any other way to tell that story anyway. And I'm so proud of him for how many lives he touched and people he inspired. That part, we talked about it, and that was very meaningful to him. It was more the fact that he had to be the clown on TV to encourage that was the difficult part. But, I've heard stories about people that, gave up their careers and moved to the other side of the world, or, switched industries and went to go work in a kitchen. And he always chuckled at those sort of things. Saying that whoever was doing it probably wasn't prepared for what they were going to find, but he was so happy for people to be adventurous and open-minded.
I mean, there's a moment that you capture in the book, behind the scenes of the moment, but the moment is famous, where he's eating noodles with President Barack Obama, and Obama's like, here's why your show is so beautiful and important, to his face, but he's saying it on TV. And I just, I guess I left your book and all this just feeling a very relatable, empathetic sadness that those words couldn't penetrate, that those words meant so much.
That was not a night of high-fiving or anything. We all went our separate ways as soon as it was done. I think part of the pressure was that was the first day of filming in Vietnam. We're like, oh my God, how the fuck are we going to film the rest of the episode to live up to that, to this? So it immediately switched to that. But in retrospect, I wish I'd felt more comfortable in the moment and celebrated that. Instead, it was more kind of a generalized feeling of not being worthy and having to, or the fear of not living up to that.
I mean, that's the most relatable content of all, honestly, in all of this. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, as a person, as a show, and as this book, it's just really compelling. It's just that there's wherever you can't outrun yourself, right? And the more work we can do to try and live with that, I think the better we all can be.
Tony was the most brilliant person I've ever met, and had better luck and advantage than most people probably who've ever been born. And he couldn't outrun it. So, yeah, I don't think anyone can outrun themselves.
No. And that's the challenge off camera for sure. We can wrap up there. Tom, it's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing yourself in the book and sharing the time with me. I mean, it's obviously, it's still very present and maybe always will be. And so being able to use that for those feelings in the book and by sharing the words that you're sharing, I think it's really meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. And thank you for reading it. And it's, putting it out there is very scary thing to do for a lot of reasons. And so to hear you say these things, it means the world to me. Thank you.
We're going to be back on Thursday with a mailbag episode, so make sure you send in your questions either to the Watch Facebook group or to the Twitter thread that started from the Watch account. We were produced, as always, by Kai McMullen. We'll see you guys on Thursday.
Squid Game next week, I promise.